If you asked me to sum up my life, I'd tell you it's a balancing act. No, more like a high-wire walk with no safety net. Between taking care of my little brother Ethan and working 2 jobs, I barely have time to breathe. But that's the way it has to be. After the crash, everything changed. Mom and Dad were gone in an instant, and suddenly it was just me and Ethan, standing at the edge of a yawning void we didn't know how to fill. He was only 6 then, clinging to me like I was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. I quit university the next day and threw myself into survival mode. Someone had to keep the lights on, the fridge stocked, and Ethan's nightmares at bay. That someone was me. During the day, I zip around the city delivering food, hot pizzas, greasy burgers, fancy salads. By night, I drive a taxi for an app-based service. The hours are long, the pay is mediocre, but it's enough to keep us afloat. Barely. Ethan's smile is what keeps me going. He's 9 now, a little quieter than most kids his age, but resilient in ways that break my heart. Every time he says, "Thanks, Liv," when I make dinner or help with homework, it reminds me why I'm doing this. Why I can't afford to stop. But lately, the nights have felt off. I started noticing it a few weeks ago. At first, it was just a handful of odd customers, people who didn't seem to belong in the world as it is now. There was the woman in the vintage dress, hair pinned up like she was headed to a gala in the 1950s. The teenager with pale, waxy skin who barely looked alive, wearing an oversized hoodie with the logo of a band I'd never heard of. And then there was the man in the tattered gray suit. I swear, he's been in my car more times than I can count. Tall and thin, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes, he always sits silently in the back seat, his hands clasped tightly on his lap. When he speaks, it's just to give me a destination. A cemetery on the edge of town, an abandoned gas station, or once, disturbingly, the parking lot of the hospital morgue. His voice is low and scratchy, like he hasn't used it in years. And there's the smell. Every time he gets out, my car reeks of burnt rubber, sharp and acrid, clinging to the seats and refusing to leave no matter how many air fresheners I use. I've asked other drivers if they've had the same issue, but they just give me weird looks and shake their heads. I try to tell myself I'm imagining things. That the stress, the exhaustion, the constant grind, it's all getting to me. But it's hard to ignore the patterns. Some of these customers, the ones I see more than once, don't seem real. I've caught glimpses of them in my rearview mirror, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes dark pits that seem to stare straight through me. I told myself I'd write it off as exhaustion. But last night, as I scrubbed at the back seat trying to get rid of that awful burnt smell again, I realized something. I don't think my clients are alive. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I saw him again, the man in the gray suit. I had just dropped off a young couple at a late-night diner and was thinking about calling it a night. My eyelids were heavy, and the thought of my warm bed, what little time I'd have to spend in it, was almost enough to make me end my shift early. But then the app pinged. A new ride request, not far from where I was parked. When I pulled up to the pickup spot, there he was, standing under a flickering streetlight. He didn't wave or signal for me, just stared at the car until I unlocked the doors. His tall, gaunt frame moved unnaturally, like a marionette with frayed strings. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound normal. He didn't respond. He never did. He just settled into the back seat, his hands folded neatly on his lap, and gave me an address in that low, gravelly voice of his. As I pulled away, I felt it again, the same strange heaviness in the air that always accompanied him. The car grew uncomfortably cold, despite the heater being on, and the faint smell of burnt rubber started creeping in. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road and not the sensation that he was staring at me. I glanced at the rearview mirror. His eyes met mine. Dark and bottomless, they bore into me with a quiet intensity that made my stomach twist. "Everything okay back there?" I asked, my voice breaking the thick silence. He didn't answer. Of course, he didn't. The address he'd given me was on the outskirts of town, a quiet residential street I'd been to once or twice before. But as we approached the turnoff, he spoke again.
"Keep going."
I hesitated. "Sir, this is the address you gave me."
"Keep going."
He repeated, his voice firmer this time. My instincts screamed at me to refuse, to stop the car and tell him to get out. But my body moved on autopilot. I drove past the turn and deeper into the outskirts, where the streetlights were few and far between, and the houses gave way to stretches of trees and empty lots. Where are we going? I asked, trying to sound calm. He didn't respond right away. Minutes passed in silence before he finally said,
Just ahead.
The road narrowed, swallowed by thick woods on either side. The GPS on my phone had given up, showing no routes, no destinations, just a blank map. My pulse quickened as I drove further into the unknown, the dark shapes of trees crowding in around the car. Finally, he spoke again.
Stop here.
I hit the brakes, my headlights illuminating a clearing just off the road. There was nothing out there, just trees and shadows. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. Are you sure this is? He was gone. The back seat was empty, the door still closed. For a moment, I sat frozen, staring at the spot where he'd been. Then I whipped around to look out the windows, scanning the clearing for any sign of him. Nothing. I scrambled out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin, and checked the back seat again. Empty. I even opened the trunk, as if he might somehow be there. Still nothing. My hands were shaking as I got back into the driver's seat and locked the doors. My breath fogged up the windshield as I sat there, trying to process what had just happened. Maybe I'd fallen asleep for a moment, dreamed the whole thing. But the lingering smell of burnt rubber told me otherwise. I drove home in a daze, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see him sitting there again. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building, my nerves were shot. Inside, Ethan was still awake, sitting cross-legged on the couch with a bowl of cereal. He looked up when I walked in, his big brown eyes immediately narrowing.
Are you okay, Liv? You look weird.
I forced a smile and ruffled his hair as I passed him. Just a long night. Go to bed soon, okay? He frowned, but didn't argue. I made my way to my room, desperate to put the night behind me. That's when I saw it. Lying on the floor was a photograph. It was old, the edges yellowed and curled, the surface creased like it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. I picked it up and held it under the light. It showed a family of 4 standing beside a car that looked eerily familiar. My stomach dropped as I recognized the make and model. It was the same car my parents had been driving the night they died. The photograph hadn't left my mind since I found it. I'd spent the better part of the day trying to figure out what to do with it. Throw it away? Burn it? Keep it? And try to convince myself it was just some bizarre coincidence? None of the options made me feel better. The car in the photo was undeniably the same model my parents had been driving. But the family? Their faces were too blurred to make out. I shoved the picture into the glove compartment before starting my shift that night. The streets were quiet, blanketed in a thin fog that softened the glow of the streetlights. I told myself I'd focus on the road, the fares, and nothing else. It wasn't long before the app pinged with another request. The pickup spot wasn't far, an intersection near a rundown corner store. When I pulled up, I saw her standing by the curb. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, dressed in an oversized coat that hung limply on her small frame. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, like she expected someone to appear behind her. As she got into the car, I noticed her hands were trembling. "Good evening," I said cautiously. She didn't respond right away, just stared down at her lap as if trying to collect her thoughts. Finally, she mumbled,
It is cold now.
I turned up the heat. "Where are you headed?" She rattled off an address that sounded familiar, but didn't specify a neighborhood. As I started driving, she murmured again.
I didn't mean to leave them.
I frowned, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes unfocused as she gazed out the window. "I'm sorry," I said, hoping to prompt her to explain. "Leave who?" Her lips moved, but the words were too faint to hear. "Miss, could you repeat that?" She turned her head slightly toward me but didn't answer. Instead, she started whispering to herself. The sound was low and rhythmic, almost like she was reciting a prayer or a mantra. I strained to catch the words, but they didn't make sense. "You okay back there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond, just kept whispering. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I turned my focus back to the road, telling myself she was probably just having a rough night. God knows I'd had plenty of those myself. At the next stoplight, I glanced at her again in the rearview mirror. My breath caught in my throat. Her face wasn't the same. Her skin had turned a sickly gray, her eyes sunken and hollow, like twin voids staring back at me. Her mouth was open, stretched unnaturally wide in a silent scream that made my stomach churn. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car jerked to a sudden halt. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached. When I whipped around to face her, the back seat was empty. I stared at the vacant seat, my heart thundering in my chest. The door was still shut, the windows intact. There was no way she could have gotten out without me noticing. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining for any sound, my eyes darting to every shadow. Slowly I leaned over to inspect the back seat. That's when I saw it. Lying on the seat where she'd been sitting was a scarf. A thin, delicate thing, soaked in a dark, red liquid. I reached for it instinctively, but the moment my fingers brushed the fabric, an icy chill shot up my arm. I recoiled, my breath hitching as I stared at the stain. It looked almost fresh, the red liquid glistening under the dim overhead light. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. The app pinged again, snapping me out of my trance. Another ride request, another destination. I stuffed the scarf into the glove compartment next to the photograph, slammed it shut, and turned off the app. I was done for the night. I couldn't stop thinking about the scarf. It sat in my glove compartment alongside the photograph. Two objects I desperately wanted to forget, but couldn't bring myself to get rid of. Every time I thought about tossing them in the trash, something inside me screamed not to. It was like they belonged to me now, whether I wanted them or not. The next morning, while Ethan was at school, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, nursing a cup of stale coffee and a growing sense of dread. I decided I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. I started searching. The gray-suited man was the first name on my mental list. He'd been a regular for weeks, and his destinations were burned into my memory. The cemetery on Pine Ridge, the abandoned gas station, the morgue parking lot. I typed those locations into the search bar, one by one, along with keywords like accident, crime, and death. The results were horrifying. The cemetery? A man had been found dead there 3 years ago, after a hit and run. The description matched my passenger perfectly. Gray suit, thin build, sunken eyes. The police had never caught the driver. The abandoned gas station? A young woman had been carjacked there. She tried to fight back, and her attacker had stabbed her before fleeing with her vehicle. The article even included a picture of her, a blurry photo of a woman with dark hair pulled into a ponytail. My chest tightened as I recognized the passenger who had left the blood-soaked scarf. I kept digging, pulling thread after thread, unraveling the lives and deaths of the people who had been riding in my taxi. Almost all of them were tied to tragic ends. Accidents, murders, disappearances. I closed the laptop, my stomach churning. What was happening to me? That night, I tried to act normal for Ethan's sake. I made dinner, helped him with his homework, and tucked him into bed like usual. But even in the small comfort of our apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It started with little things. I'd set my keys on the counter, turn around, and find them on the table. Lights flickered, though our landlord swore the wiring was fine. I'd hear faint whispers just as I was drifting off to sleep, words I couldn't make out but felt in my bones. Then, Ethan started seeing things.
Liv?
He said one night as I was washing dishes. Yeah, buddy? He hesitated, standing in the doorway to the kitchen, his face pale.
Do you believe in ghosts?
I froze, the soapy plate slipping from my hands and clattering into the sink. Why do you ask?
There's a man in my room.
He whispered. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? What man?
A shadow man. He stands in the corner and watches me. He doesn't talk, but I think he wants to.
I grabbed his hand and marched him into his room, my heart pounding. Of course, there was no one there. But Ethan refused to sleep alone after that, and I didn't blame him. I was losing control. Every time I thought about quitting the taxi job, my bank account reminded me I didn't have the luxury. Bills were piling up, and Ethan deserved a life better than this. So I pushed the fear aside, night after night, and kept driving. Until the note appeared. It was just past midnight when I parked the car to take a short break. The fog on the windshield had thickened, obscuring my view of the street. I reached for the defroster but stopped when I saw it. Words. They were written in the fog on the inside of the windshield, jagged and uneven as if scratched by invisible fingers. You're one of us now. My throat tightened as I stared at the message, my mind scrambling for an explanation. I hadn't written it. I hadn't seen anyone near my car. The air inside felt colder, heavier, as if the message itself carried weight. I grabbed a rag from the glove box and wiped the glass clean, my hands trembling. When I looked up again, the street was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned off the app and drove home. The windshield had been clear for days. No messages. No whispers. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, like the air before a thunderstorm. The app pinged just after 10 p.m., pulling me out of my thoughts. A request downtown, not far from where I'd parked. I took it without hesitation. Anything to keep my mind occupied. The first passenger of the night was an older man in a threadbare coat. He sat in the back and stared out the window, muttering under his breath. At first I thought he was on the phone, but there was no device in his hand. "Excuse me?" I asked after a few minutes. "Everything okay back there?" He paused, turned slightly toward me, and nodded. Then he whispered.
They're here with us, watching.
A chill ran down my spine. "Who's watching?" He didn't answer. Just kept muttering to someone, or something I couldn't see. When I dropped him off, he stepped out without a word. I watched him shuffle into the shadows, his whispers fading with him. I barely had time to catch my breath before the next ping came. This time it was a young man in his early 30s. He was sharply dressed, but had a strange, glassy look in his eyes. The moment he got in, he smiled at me.
Olivia.
He said softly, drawing out the syllables of my name like he'd been practicing it. I froze. I hadn't introduced myself, and my name wasn't displayed anywhere in the car. "How do you know my name?" I asked, my voice more confrontational than I intended. He chuckled, leaning back in his seat.
Oh, I know lots of things about you, Olivia.
I wanted to pull over to kick him out, but I couldn't make myself do it. Something about the way he looked at me, his unblinking eyes locked on the rearview mirror, left me rooted in place. For the entire ride he kept repeating my name in a soft, rhythmic tone. "Olivia, Olivia, Olivia." When we reached his destination, he turned to me, his grin wider than before.
See you soon.
The door slammed shut behind him, and I peeled away without looking back. I was shaking by the time the next ping came. I almost ignored it, but the location caught my attention. It was nearby, and my gut told me it wasn't just another coincidence. The gray-suited man was waiting under a flickering street lamp. He climbed into the back seat without a word and gave me an address. I recognized it immediately. "No," I said, gripping the wheel. "I'm not going there." He leaned forward, his breath cold on the back of my neck.
Drive.
Something inside me buckled. My hands moved on their own, turning the wheel and guiding the car toward the address. The road grew darker as we left the city behind, the streetlights thinning out until there was nothing but my headlights cutting through the fog. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, glancing at him in the mirror. He sat still, his face expressionless.
You'll understand soon.
"That's not an answer," I snapped. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "Who are you? What are you?" He tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me.
Do you believe in fate, Olivia?
The question sent a shiver down my spine. We were getting close. I could feel it, even before I saw the familiar curve in the road, the place where my parents' car had skidded out of control. As we neared the site, the radio flickered to life. Static filled the car, broken by faint whispers that grew louder and louder. My name came through the distortion, overlapping voices calling to me, pleading, sobbing. "Turn it off," I yelled, twisting the knob, but the static remained. Then the headlights caught something up ahead, figures standing along the roadside, shadowy, indistinct shapes that flickered in and out of view. "Who are they?" I whispered.
They are waiting.
The man said, his voice calm. "For what?"
For you.
I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, the tires crunching on gravel. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. When I turned around to face him, the back seat was empty. Of course, he was gone. I reached for the ignition, desperate to leave, but the car wouldn't start. I twisted the key over and over, but the engine only groaned in protest. The radio's static grew louder, and the voices were clearer now. "Olivia." I looked up, and the road was gone. Darkness surrounded the car, pressing against the windows. The shadowy figures were closer now, their faces just barely visible, faces I recognized. My parents, the man in the gray suit. the young woman with the scarf, the others I'd driven, all staring at me with hollow eyes. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The voices on the radio spoke in unison, their tone cold and final. "You're one of us now." The radio crackled with voices, their tone haunting and layered, as if every passenger I'd ever driven was speaking at once. I gripped the steering wheel, frozen, as the shadowy figures closed in. Their faces were familiar, too familiar. My parents stood at the front, their expressions a mix of sorrow and urgency. The gray-suited man lingered behind them, his face emotionless as ever. Then the scene shifted. The darkness around the car dissolved into a blinding flash of light, and suddenly, I wasn't sitting in the driver's seat anymore. I was standing by the side of the road, the air heavy with the acrid smell of burning rubber and twisted metal. Ahead of me, 2 cars were crumpled together like discarded toys. My parents' station wagon, its hood crushed, steam hissing from the engine. And the other car, sleek black and unmistakably familiar. The gray-suited man's car. I took a shaky step forward, the scene playing out in front of me like a movie I couldn't stop. My younger self, sitting in the back seat beside Ethan, was crying, clutching his hand as the chaos unfolded. My parents' voices were frantic, their hands fumbling to unbuckle seatbelts. And then the gray-suited man. He stumbled out of his car, blood trickling down his forehead. He looked at the wreckage, his eyes wide with panic, and then he ran. "You did this," I whispered, the words barely audible over the phantom sounds of the crash. The man appeared beside me, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't deny it.
I did. And I've paid for it every day since.
The ground beneath me felt like it was crumbling. "You're telling me this now? After everything?" He tilted his head, his expression unreadable.
Because you need to understand.
I turned to the wreckage again. The scene shifted once more. This time there was no movement, no sound, just my parents' lifeless bodies slumped forward, the mangled remains of the station wagon. And then I saw us, me and Ethan, sitting perfectly still in the back seat. Except, we weren't moving either. "No," I whispered, stepping closer to the car. My hand trembled as I reached out, but it passed through the window like smoke. The truth hit me all at once, sharp and suffocating. "We didn't survive, did we?" The gray-suited man's voice was soft but firm.
No.
I staggered back, my chest tightening as memories I didn't know I'd lost came rushing in. The flash of headlights, the sound of metal screaming against metal, the silence that followed. "But Ethan," I choked out, "he's still." The man stepped forward.
Ethan is as much a part of this illusion as you are.
I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No, he's alive. I've been taking care of him. I've been..."
Living a lie. You created this world to cope, to shield yourself from the truth. But it's time, Olivia. It's time to let go.
I sank to my knees, the weight of his words crushing me. Why me? Why the passengers? Why any of this? His expression softened, a flicker of something almost human crossing his face.
You've been helping them, Olivia, guiding them, ferrying them to where they need to go. But now it's your turn.
The voices around us grew louder, and my parents stepped forward. My mother knelt beside me, her hand ghosting through my hair in a familiar gesture.
"It's okay, sweetheart. You've done so much. But you don't have to stay anymore."
My father stood behind her, his eyes glistening.
"We're waiting for you, both of you."
I looked up at them, my heart breaking and mending all at once. "Ethan, I can't leave him."
"He's waiting for you."
My mother whispered. The fog swirled around me, and suddenly, Ethan was there, standing just a few feet away. He looked confused, clutching the stuffed bear he used to carry everywhere when he was little.
"Liv?"
He said, his voice small. I ran to him, pulling him into my arms. He clung to me, his body warm and solid.
"What is happening?"
He asked, his voice muffled against my shoulder. "It's okay, buddy," I said, my voice cracking. "We're going to be okay." The gray-suited man stepped back, fading into the shadows. The figures surrounding us began to dissolve, their faces peaceful as they disappeared into the light. My parents held out their hands, their smiles radiant. I took Ethan's hand in mine and stepped forward. The last thing I saw was my taxi, sitting empty by the side of the road, its engine silent. And then there was light.